Is there really an alternative to the backstop, the Irish border issue that's blocked any parliamentary agreement on a Brexit deal? Boris Johnson, in his letter to the EU Council President, appears to believe there is, although offers little detail. The Prime Minister says the backstop is anti-democratic and inconsistent with the sovereignty of the UK as a state, but adds the government would not put in place infrastructure checks or controls at the border. We would be happy, he says, to accept a legally binding commitment to this effect and hope that the EU would do likewise.
I think the letter makes clear is that this really is now our best and last chance to get a deal, to get an agreement that can get through the House of Commons. And if we are unable, if the EU are unable to move on this issue, then we are going to leave on the 31st of October. That's what we've committed to.
That was this morning. By lunchtime, Donald Tusk had tweeted the Council's response to Mr Johnson's basis for negotiations in the run-up to October the 31st. Mr Tusk was rather dismissive. He said those against the backstop and not proposing realistic alternatives in fact support re-establishing a border, even if they do not admit it. Opening gambits or merely theatre? The Prime Minister responded to the response to his initial proposals.
At the moment, it is absolutely true that our friends and partners are a bit negative. And you were getting, I saw what Donald Tusk had to say, and it, it wasn't redolent of a sense of optimism. But I think actually we'll get there.
It's very unclear what the Prime Minister thinks he's negotiating. He needs to recognise that by just holding the threat of a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October towards the European Union isn't going to bring about a change. It's going to make things much worse.
The government this afternoon issued a statement announcing that ministers and civil servants will no longer be attending most EU meetings from September the 1st. Representation no longer needed, it said. The priority was to unshackle officials so that they can refocus on Brexit plans and on trade agreements with other countries. Some Brexit-opposing MPs said the Prime Minister is making demands he knows the EU will turn down, so he can blame them if we leave without a deal. Equally, Mr Johnson is blaming some MPs who are trying to block a no deal for why the EU won't give concessions. He's meeting Angela Merkel in Berlin tomorrow to ask for just that. But with both her and Tusk insisting the withdrawal agreement cannot be reopened, there appears little prospect of a sudden change in direction.
Simon Israel reporting. Well, I'm joined now from Dublin by Senator Neil Richmond, who is chair of the Irish Senate's Brexit Committee. So can anybody, Senator, on your committee see any way forward which respects the need for the European Union to have a seal on its trading community, and yet at the same time not to have a border with Northern Ireland?
Well, this has been the great difficulty that has been discussed over the last 3 years, and indeed we flagged this long in advance of the referendum in the UK. It was extremely unfortunate that this situation and the UK's responsibilities to the border in Ireland, and indeed the Good Friday Agreement, were never discussed in the campaign, indeed weren't a factor. We have worked consistently on the European side with our British counterparts over the last 18 months, through 18 tortuous months of negotiations, to produce what is a compromise agreement, a withdrawal agreement that takes into account the British government's own red lines, their commitments, and indeed produces a withdrawal agreement with the backstop and a future partnership declaration that we believe is absolutely the pathway towards a managed Brexit.
The difficulty is that in our own Parliament, that went down. It didn't get through.
Indeed, I see that, and it's quite interesting that a lot of focus has been on the backstop. But the 60 ERG MPs wrote just last week saying that they'd reject the withdrawal agreement regardless. We see the Labour Party, the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, they didn't reject the withdrawal agreement because of the backstop. And indeed the Prime Minister, who now is using extremely unfortunate language such as anti-democratic, backed this agreement himself.
Is a border inevitable?
We certainly don't think so. We very much hope so. But every day that we get closer to a no deal, both the Irish and British governments lose full control over that border. And that's what's crucially important here. We both have responsibilities as the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. an international peace treaty lodged with the United Nations. If we give up control, the British government will have responsibilities to the WTO, any future partners, but equally, the Irish government will seek to protect the single market which we are remaining within. We can work this out. As he said, there's about 10 weeks to go, but ultimately, we want to move on to the next stage of negotiations, armed with the insurance policy of the backstop that we never actually want to see come into play.
One almost senses that the people, both north and south possibly, are kind of forgetting the utter carnage and horror that occurred around the border over all those years. Is that not informing any kind of part of the debate?
Oh, we have not forgotten. I grew up during the Troubles, John. Just last night, we saw a very worrying development when a bomb exploded in Fermanagh, right along the Irish border. Thankfully, no one was hurt. Only a couple of months ago, we saw the sad murder of journalist Lyra McKee by dissident paramilitaries. There's been 9 dissident paramilitary activities this year compared to just 1 last year. We know that, we bear it in mind, and that's why we need the backstop, to ensure there is no hardening of border, that there isn't a risk to what is a very fragile peace process. We know that, we respect that, the European side has been consistent on it. However, it is the British government who equally has that responsibility and can't simply walk away from it and say they won't put up something when they will have responsibilities that might not make that possible.
And do you think that that is uppermost in the minds of the people that are involved, both sides on this, both in Europe and both in Britain? Do you believe that those issues that you marked out so coherently are uppermost in their minds?
Well, I can only speak for the European side, but I've met Michel Barnier, I've met President Juncker, President Tusk, and incoming Presidents von der Leyen and Michel, and they absolutely reaffirm their commitment to the Good Friday Agreement, as we've noticed a number of American congressmen and women have done too. But one thing that is clear is that Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, never actually visited the border. Michel Barnier is upcoming for his 6th visit next month.